When I first heard of the proposition for a carbon tax, I thought that it was ridiculous and one would be detrimental to any economy on which one is imposed. However, after hearing the case for a carbon tax, I've come to the conclusion that one is necessary to correct an error which a free market alone cannot correct. A tax on carbon emissions will provide the economic incentive necessary to reduce carbon emissions to a sustainable level. Before taking AP Environmental Science and Economics, I never really put too much thought into the longevity of humanity's exponentially increasing impact on the world around us. However, after taking these classes, it is clear that the current level of carbon emissions is unsustainable and that something drastic needs to change this generation in order to preserve the prosperity of both the global economy and the environment around us for future generations. To better understand why this approach to controlling carbon emissions is effective, we must first define what exactly an externality is. According to Will Kenton at Investopedia, an externality is a cost or benefit caused by a producer that is not financially incurred or received by that producer. In other words, an externality occurs when there is a cost imposed on a party that is not involved in the transaction. We can think of carbon emissions as an externality when considering the transaction between a gas station and a driver purchasing fuel. The gas station buys fuel at a bulk price according to the supply of fuel and the cost of extracting, transporting, and refining that fuel, then sets the price based on the operational costs of the gas station and the demand for fuel. However, nowhere in this list of costs which factor into the price are the environmental costs that burning that fossil fuel has on the environment. According to Rebecca Lindsay, in her 2020 article, Climate Change Atmospheric Carbon Dioxide on climate.gov, human activities have increased the natural concentration of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, amplifying the Earth's natural greenhouse effect, and that the oceans have absorbed enough carbon dioxide to lower its pH levels by 0.1 units, a 30% increase in acidity. The list of environmental externalities goes on long enough to fill the entire time for this presentation. However, I will end with just one externality that is not environmental, as many people are not completely convinced of the severity of the environmental externalities of burning fossil fuels. And this externality is that not included in the price of the consumption of fossil fuels is the cost associated with building an entire global economy on which billions of lives depend on a resource which is limited to, at most, a few centuries worth of energy. While the issue of carbon emissions is relatively new, there have been many propositions to correct for this issue. The most effective way to solve this issue is to look at carbon emissions for what it is, a failure in the market to place fossil fuels and other sources of carbon emissions at its true price. In the case of a market failure, government intervention is often necessary. In this case, a tax on carbon emissions would be the most effective way to correct this market failure. Economics states that as the price of a good increases, the demand for that same good will decrease. Okay, so it's simple then. We just tax carbon emissions at 10,000%, right? Well, unfortunately it's not that simple. According to Sean Ross, a writer for Investopedia, price elasticity of demand is an indicator for the impact on the demand for a product in relation to its change in price. In the short term, fossil fuels' price elasticity of demand is very low because changing one's demand for fossil fuel often is expensive and requires large changes to one's own lifestyle. However, the long-term price elasticity of demand is much greater, meaning that the demand for fossil fuel often takes time to adjust to its change in price. The long-term elasticity of fossil fuels has historical precedents as well. According to Khan Academy, due to a previous price increase in crude oil, in 1983, U.S. petroleum consumption was 15.3 million barrels a day, which was lower than in 1973 or 1975. U.S. petroleum consumption was down even though the U.S. economy was about 1/4 larger in 1983 than it had been in 1973. The primary reason for the lower quantity was that higher energy prices spurred conservational efforts, and after a decade of home insulation, more fuel-efficient cars, more efficient appliances and machinery, and other fuel-conserving efforts, the demand curve for energy had become more elastic. So, we know that the market responds to increases in the price of fossil fuels over time by reducing the demand and consumption of these fossil fuels. And we know that there is a market failure in the accounting for the true price of carbon emitting fossil fuels. What can we do about this? The gradual introduction of a carbon tax is one of the best options for mitigating the externalities of introducing additional carbon into the carbon cycle. According to an MIT News article written by David L. Chandler, an analysis of a carbon tax's effectiveness indicates that starting with a $50 per ton carbon tax and increasing it by 5% per year would lead to a 63% reduction in total U.S. greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. He goes on to explain that just an initial tax of $25 per ton would be enough to satisfy the United States' former pledge to the Paris Agreement, as long as we maintain that same increase of 5% per year. Furthermore, the revenue from a carbon tax could also be used to subsidize alternatives to fossil fuels, which have a positive externality of being beneficial to the environment by further reducing the economic dependence on fossil fuels and propelling society towards a sustainable and responsible future. The discussed information strongly suggests that an at least partial solution to the issue of carbon emissions causing climate change can be found in the viewing of the introduction of additional carbon into the carbon cycle for what it is, an externality that imposes costs on non-consenting parties. As is the case with most externalities and market failures, they justify calls for government intervention. In this case, the government intervention would be a carbon tax to place fossil fuels at their true market price. In the implementation of this carbon tax, the possibilities for humanity are endless. It has long been a joke that we have been 30 years away from efficient fusion energy for the past half century. However, if we provide economic incentive through a carbon tax for this to happen, then we might actually be 30 years away from efficient fusion energy. Either way, even if we don't achieve that, we will definitely achieve effective means of perfecting the clean energies which we already have, such as solar and wind. Thank you.